the first month of 2024. I have prayerfully considered to bring some topics that we want to have our minds and heart together and think about how we can be ready for 2024. So this month, especially, I'm going to bring some of the messages that we won't hear that often, but as a reminding to us as a way to remember what we need to focus on. And so I'm going to focus today and next couple more Sundays on what we call the conflict management. This is a big word in our culture, in our schools or working places, big businesses. People spend a lot of money talking about seminars like this, right? Conflict management, conflict resolution. And so these are very, very practical things that apply to us in all of our lives, right? Whether you are a family member, how do you handle conflict within your family? Husband and wife, how do you handle differences of opinions? It comes to, again, maybe school, maybe it comes to church. Everywhere you go, we are faced with conflict. And how do you handle them? And now we're not just talking about handling them in a best possible way, but we're talking about what does the Bible say? How does the Bible teach, how does Bible give us guidance as to what to do? And so, so often we think about these kinds of sermons when the church is struggling with conflicts or stuff like that, right? So I can say it to my own mind and my heart that over the some echoing I hear for some reason. Srishti, can you see if you can turn some of the mics down or maybe turn me down? But it's gone now. Okay, so what I wanted to talk to you about is about conflict. And what I was saying is that not that I see conflict in our church. Do you see conflict in our church? I haven't. I've been here 2 years now. This month will complete my 2 years. If you're ready to kick me out, I suppose I'll just pack my bag and go. But I would say last year, especially last year, our church has had that unity. Our church has had that love for one another. And there is a loving and growing attitude amongst ourselves. And so I'm not bringing this message so that, we have problems in the church. No, I don't see problems at all. We are doing well, and sometimes we need to talk about these kinds of things when we're doing well. Otherwise, you will say, Sham just brought this message because we had fights with so-and-so last week. He is in our mind, and he's preaching at us, and he's getting mad at me, or whatever, right? So often, sermons can be looked upon that way. So I want to give you that authority that as far as I'm concerned, as far as I'm in a little way, I'm the head of your family in the sense of what I do. I have not heard any conflict that would be, I would say, it's problematic. And so I'm not bringing these series or things that we'll be talking about this month. 1 week I'll be talking about giving. And when we talk about giving, I'm not, again, bashing on anybody either. We're doing well. You're giving to the Lord, and the church is blessed. And I want to encourage you to continue to do that. So when I bring the message on giving this month, again, we don't have problem. And it's going to be another sermon will be on serving in the church. Again, when it comes to serving, all of our church members do everything that we do. What a joy that is that everybody gets involved in the service of the Lord. So we are doing certain things right. We are heading towards the right direction, and yet we must be reminded of certain, slackiness that we could have and invite these things to be a problem in the church. Okay, so this morning we're going to look at conflict management, solving interpersonal conflict biblically. Now, I know I have taught this topic many times because I was a school counselor, and school counseling in one of our curriculum being able to handle conflict in a healthy manner is one of the core things that we have to teach our kids, whether they are elementary kids or they high school kids or even maybe going to college, right? So I've taught these lessons many, many times, but not in the sense of what we're going to do here in the church. So bear with me if some things are very, very common sense things that you know really well. Praise God, you know them. And where there is challenge, I hope you will take that challenge and say, you know what, I need to be a little better at this. And so this is a very, very common topic, and I'm pretty sure many of you are well aware of all the pitfalls, all the strengths of it. But let's look at it together and try to learn together, okay? Then let me begin with number one. What is conflict? This morning you can see I have three main questions that we'll be answering. What is conflict? And what are the causes of conflicts would be another question that we'll be looking at. And number three would be what are some of the common sources of conflict. And so those are the three main questions that will be answered this morning. So what is conflict? If you go back one more, Srishti, one more slide. I know Srishti is working on the video and all that. You can see some of the books that are helpful out there, and I have used especially the Everyday Conflict and Peacemaker book. I've read them many, many times, and it's very helpful to do that. So I would recommend if you are looking for a New Year's resolution and you want to read a book, you can start on one of these. These are good resources. And then this morning, again, a lot of the ideas that I have are also coming from these books here, okay? So let's look at what is conflict. Number one, what is conflict? A sharp disagreement or argument. A sharp disagreement or argument. Well, if you have lived so far, the age that you have and family that you have, or the husband, the wife you have, these are not uncommon, right? We always have conflict. We always have disagreements. We always have dislikes and likes, and sometimes we learn to grow out of them, and we say, you know what, I'll accept the other person the way they are, as he is, and I will, husband might say, I'll accept the other person is the way they are. And so we learn to adapt to the conflict, but a conflict in a very, very simplistic way, a sharp disagreement or argument, and especially the conflict becomes a little bit more hard to deal with as it goes longer period of time. So a long drawn out conflict would cause much pain and sorrow in our own relationships. Sometimes we can handle conflict easily, but sometimes it is very sharp, very divisive, very hard to deal with. Sometimes we agree to disagree and move on without much pain, and that's always nice. When I can say, Jim, I agree to disagree with you, but you're my friend, right? So some of those disagreements don't bother us at all. But it's not same with all areas of life. Some we cannot move on. Some we cannot just say, all right, I'll just leave it behind. But other times, conflict often leads to fights, division, anger, and hatred. Because when it becomes a long-lasting issue, it becomes something that is hard to handle. And because of this, we must understand and take conflicts very seriously and deal with them in a way that God is glorified. And again, we'll look at that, how conflict is to glorify God. Even in the midst of our sinfulness, even when we have sinned, God says that we can glorify Him. And even in the midst of the conflicts that you and I are going through, or maybe will go through, we can bring glory and honor to God. And that is the purpose of our lesson. It's not to avoid conflict. It's not to say conflicts will never happen. But Lord, when conflict does come, how can I think about you? How can I bring glory and honor to your name? And that is what we're looking at. Galatians 5:17 gives us a clear indication why we have conflicts. Galatians 5:17 says, "For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want." So the Bible tells us that you and I are in constant conflict. The Spirit of God, which is holy and righteous, and us, who are sinful and flesh, desires of the flesh, and we are sinful. And so God, who is holy, God, who is the truth, and we are sinful, wanting to live according to God's standards, we always fail. And as a result, there's constant, ongoing conflict for righteousness, for doing things right and making things right. So that is what a conflict may be defined as. As simple as that is, it is a disagreement. Long drawn out, could be deeper and harder to deal with, right? So disagreement is a conflict when you cannot get along with the other people's views or ideas. Number two then, let's move on to number two then. What are the sources of conflicts? What do we know? What does the Bible say? Where do they come from? And we want to look at those 4 or 5 sources of conflicts. Okay, number one, I call it misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. We had plenty of that early in our first year together, right? I've come from Asia. My mindset is a little bit of Asian. Even in some ways, my culture is a little different. And you're like, what? We didn't get this white guy to preach to us? He says things funny. He does things funny. It's just hard to understand him. And you gave me a chance to explain to you, and you're here today. In some ways, right? So misunderstandings is one of the common sources of conflicts. My perspective, my eyesight, what I heard, what I felt could lead me to a wrong conclusion. Do you know that? Sometimes we say, I saw what you did. I heard what you said. I perceived the way you were thinking things or whatever, but they all could be a wrong conclusion. And so when we just suppose and we just imagine and think that that other person meant to do this, other person said to hurt me, other person said to bring destruction to me, we assume that my perspective is right and what I think is right. And so conflict comes as a result of understanding in a wrong way. A very good example that I found in the Bible is a story in 1 Samuel 1. It's a sad story, and yet how easily we can make mistakes assuming certain things to be different. Sometimes we want to assume what I want it to be true, not what the situation might be, but I want this to be true, therefore I will assume this is what that person means. 1 Samuel chapter 1, starting at verse 10, there's a story of Hannah praying in the temple. Hannah is in deep despair. She is just pouring her heart to God. The most beautiful picture may be somebody praying in the most pure sense. She has no guile in her. She's not thinking about anybody's ill. Look what happens. 1 Samuel 1, verse 10. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son. then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. It's a beautiful prayer, right? It's devotion to God. As he kept on praying to the Lord, Eli, the priest, the one who is supposed to be spiritual, Eli observed her mouth. He had his perspective. He looked and he saw something. Verse 13, Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. So, what did Eli thought? So Eli thought she was drunk. What a sad story. Most, again, I just like I said, beautiful picture of somebody's devotion to God. No guile in her. And here, somebody looks at her with that kind of downplaying of what's happening, assumes that she's drunk, and said to her, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put your wine away." So there we see how wrong Eli was, wasn't he? He assumed something to be true. His perspectives he thought was right. But no, he was very, very wrong. So misunderstandings cause us to have much conflict and fights in our churches or in our homes, in our families, in our schools. So what are we to do about misunderstandings? We are not to assume certain things to be certain just because you think they are certain. What are we to do? We are to, and we'll look at all these things as we move on, but we're not to assume certain things to be true. Simplest things we can do is what? Go to that person. Let's say here in our story, Eli could have simply asked Hannah, "Hannah, you look like drunk in the morning. Are you drunk?" It's simple like that. Before assuming and declaring somebody guilty of something, you could simply ask. So your misunderstandings, what you thought, could be cleared very easily, right? And so misunderstandings bring a lot of fights in our churches or in our homes, in our families. So make sure that you're not assuming things. You are saying things because on the basis of factual things, not make-up things. Number two then, sources of conflicts. Number two then, differences in values and goals. Differences in values and goals. Personal goals and values may differ from person to person, right? Even within the United States, I find that if you're from the South, you might value certain things a little different than the North. So even with a person to person, we have different values and goals. Let's look at, for example, a marriage. A homeschooled wife might have difficulty convincing a husband who went to public school to homeschool their children. Is that true? It could, because a wife came from a homeschool situation, and she loves homeschooling and wants to do the same thing for her kids. And the husband came from public school, and he says, "Nah, we always looked at homeschool as, whatever. We don't want to homeschool." And so you could have values that are different. There's goals are different, and conflict can easily happen in that marriage. At times, even with that little case, people are about to divorce each other because those values are big and strong and very meaningful to them. What about money management? You may have a rich background and you don't mind spending a lot of money on whatever things you do, and the other person has come from a very poor background and doesn't want to waste, even those kinds of things bring a lot of conflict. So we have values and goals different, and when they fight against each other, we have problem. Time management, project management. My dad had one of the elders in First Baptist Church in Arlington. He was an engineer at Boeing. And that engineer had pens lined up and keys lined up, and everything was planned and organized in a way that you and I would be like, man, I'm pretty sure he had underwears all lined up maybe. Some people are that way, all organized, right? And he wanted the church to run the same way. Everything had to be very, very, very much like him. And so we could have personalities and people that have different opinions and ideas, and we bring those things together, and we have what? Differences in values and goals, and conflicts can easily happen. Let me take you to a few verses in the New Testament that I see some struggles that New Testament believers, the apostles, were having just because the goals and values were kind of collapsing or colliding. Let's go to Acts chapter 15, verse 1. Acts chapter 15, verse 1 and 2. Acts chapter 15, verse 1 and verses 1 and 2. Certain people came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. So here we had a very much doctrinal issue. Some people came from Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the hub. The mother church was there. All the apostles were there. And anything that came out of Jerusalem should have been a valuable thing for Christians all over the area to obey and to learn. But that wasn't the case. Unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. Verse 2, this brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. And so here we see a conflict that was so sharp that they had to solve this issue right away. So the values or the teachings, the doctrines were dividing this group of people, and they went to Jerusalem to get that solved. And if you read chapter 15 of Acts, you will see how they solved the issue. They decided that for all Christians, all leaders, that adding anything to salvation was not biblical. That being circumcised was not equal to being saved. Nor could you earn salvation by works. And that was a great conflict that they had, and the conflict was solved. This brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debated with them. So Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with some other believers, to go to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. In the same chapter, Acts chapter 15, starting at verse 39, there's another conflict. Acts chapter 15, verse 39, they had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So what has happened here in chapter 15 is that Paul and Barnabas had gone on a missionary journey, and they had taken Mark with them. So here we have Saul and Barnabas, and Mark had gone with them. And in Pamphylia, Mark had deserted Paul. For whatever reason, he said, I'm done, I'm going to go home. And so Paul brings that issue here. They want to go back to the churches again, second missionary journey, and Barnabas says, you know what, let's take Mark with us. And Paul says, no, let's not take Mark. He doesn't last long. He doesn't like persecution. I don't know, whatever the case was. So Paul says, let's not take Mark. And they had really sharp division, conflict over goals and the way they wanted to work. They separated themselves and they went different ways. In Galatians, in the book of Galatia, Galatians chapter 2, there's another case of Paul having a conflict with Peter, one of the apostles, right? Galatians 2:11, now when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face, because he was to be blamed. For before certain men came from James, he would eat with the Gentiles, but when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. So here, Paul and Peter, and they're having a good meal. They're eating with the Gentiles. The Jews and Gentiles were eating together. But we're told that some men from James came, and all of a sudden they started to move tables around. I don't want to be seen with the Gentiles. I want to eat with Jews. And even Peter was carried away, and he was moving his table to another table. And Paul saw that, and he was very angry, or he was disturbed by it, and he went to his face, Paul says, and he told Peter how wrong he was to do this. And there's a conflict there too, right? So here we see a lot of our differences in values and goals can always cause a lot of conflicts. Not only misunderstandings, number one, misunderstandings, we looked at that. Number two, differences in values. Let's look at number three, the source of conflict. Number three is stress. Number three is stress. By stress, I mean anxiety and stress. They kind of go together. Sometimes stress and anxiety overcome us, and our dealings with people are affected by them. Our minds and hearts are preoccupied with internal conflict, and we end up saying things or doing things that hurt others. Some people are more anxious than others. They are easily stressed, and you will always have quarrels if you do not know how to understand them. So anxiety and stress cause us to what? Misbehave. If I have some stress in my mind, I'm anxious about something, and my wife says something of me or wants something from me, I will lash out on her, right? I'll be angry, or I'll say some things. I'm not thinking about any of the things. I'm thinking about what I'm burdened with. And because of that, my response to the one I love becomes hurtful. And so stress and anxiety, they seem to work that way. Let me take you to Philippians chapter 2 and look at this case of anxiety and stress, how that had caused some problems in the church. Chapter 2, verse 1, I implore Euodia and I implore Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. And I urge you also, true companion, help these women who labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. So Paul saw Euodia and Syntyche causing problems in the church. They were not getting along. They were divisive. They were fighting, whatever was going on. And he goes on to verses 4, 5, and 6 to give us a little bit more light into their situation. These two ladies were arguing and fighting being divisive, and the real problem was the anxiety and stress that they were going through. Look at what he says in verse 4, chapter 2, verse 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. He just got done saying, you two ladies, be united, be at peace, solve your conflicts. The way you do that is by what? Number one, rejoice in the Lord always. You ladies, focus on the things of God. And he says, again I say rejoice. What is he saying here? He's saying rejoice, be thankful, be positive, look to God and be thankful in the area of anxiety and stress. When you are under anxious thoughts, rejoice in the Lord. Seek to be positive. Do not dwell in your negativity. So, first thing anxious people need to do is rejoice in the Lord. Number two, then, let your gentleness be known to all men. Verse 5 says, let your gentleness be known to all men. The Lord is at hand. What is he saying here? Be forbearing, be yielding, accommodating, be other-centered. So in the stress and anxiety and when you don't get along, you have to be yielding to others' needs and others' wants and desires. Don't be so anxious and always be thinking about yourself. Be thinking about others. Verse 6, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Basically what he's saying here is anxiousness. The word anxious, the word actually could literally mean falling apart into pieces. Because of fear and anxiety, some people could be falling into pieces. The world is not falling apart. Learn to trust God and who is in control. And so here, if you do that, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard you and you guard your hearts and your minds through Jesus Christ. So the source of conflict many times could be that anxiety and stress that you live with. And so to be able to manage that anxiety and stress is very important, because otherwise that's going to be the problem, right? It's going to be always there. Some people are, again, just like I said, more anxious than others. If you're not an anxious person, be very kind and understanding to those who are. If you are a very anxious person, understand your weakness and try not to let your anxiety always destroy relationships. If you're not careful, you can easily do that. So the sources of conflicts, misunderstandings, number one. Number two, difference in values and goals. Number three, stress and anxiety. Number four, ultimately, this is where we all come, sinful attitudes and desires. Sinful attitudes and desires. And we'll go to James for that, James chapter 4, verse 1 and 3. But sinful attitudes and desires. Let me read Galatians 5:16 for you before we go to James. Galatians 5:16, I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. And the Bible very clearly tells us that if you are walking in the Spirit, you are walking more victoriously. If you're walking in the flesh, then you're losing your battles most of the time. So, verse 19 says, Galatians 5:19, now the works of the flesh are this. And works of the flesh, what flesh produces is a long list of things. Let me just quickly read that to you. Adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions. We're talking about conflict, right? Contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambition, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, rivalries. All of these things are because we give into our flesh. We give into our sinful desires. We have fights and conflicts and quarrels. So when we talk about conflict, undoubtedly, in our midst, especially for our believers, that sinful attitudes and desires could be at the center. So we have to examine ourselves. Look at James chapter 4, verse 1. James chapter 4, verse 1. Where do wars and fights come from among you? It's very clear, isn't it? Where do conflicts come from? Where do all these things that cause fights and quarrels, they come from? They come from you, James says. They come from you. Do they not come from your desires for pleasures that war in your members? You lust and you do not have. You murder, you covet, and you do not obtain. You cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may send it on your pleasures. So sinful attitudes, sinful desires, first of all, we have uncontrolled desire. Uncontrolled desire, that is sinful desires. It's not controlled. It's like addiction. Addiction to fulfill sinful things. And when we live in that addictive mode to the sinful things, you're not going to produce righteous stuff. It's going to be sinful things. Not only that, you have unfulfilled desire, James says. You have unfulfilled desires. You have wants and wants. Never to give. You always have wants. I have not been given right. I have not been served right. Whatever that is, I have not gotten enough. James says that produces conflict. Not only that, selfish desires, right? Selfish. You ask, you want to, but it's all to fulfill your own self. So the sinful things cause us to have conflict in our marriage, in our church, in our schools, wherever you may be in your workplace, and it's very, very hard to deal with these kinds of issues. So what are the causes of conflicts? Misunderstandings, differences in values and goals, stress, anxiety, sinful attitudes and desires. Number 3, then quickly, before we go into our communion service. Number 3, what are some of the common responses to conflicts? What are some of the common responses to conflicts? How many of you love conflict? Zeke loves conflict. He says, that's good for you, Zeke. Common responses, and I'm pretty sure you know how you respond to conflict because you know yourself, right? Number 1, some people respond by, I call that escape response. I think the book also calls it the same, escape response. Escape response. This type of escaping or running away from conflicts include denial, it includes flight, or includes suicide. Okay, so let's look at denial. You want to run away from a conflict, you don't want to handle it, it's just too much for you, or sometimes you may even think, conflict is not good. I'm a Christian, I shouldn't have a conflict, and you know what? I won't touch it, I won't want to face it, I'll just ignore it. There's a denial. Act as if it's not happening. My wife sometimes tells me, don't have your head in the sand. There's things are going on, I'm like, I don't see, I don't hear, no problem. That's not, denial really doesn't help anything. Denial doesn't solve any. Pretend that the problem does not exist is not solving your problem. Running away, you will always be a runner, right, if you do that. You can't always be running away from conflict. Leave the church. Maybe that will bring me a little bit of a less conflict. Leave my job. Maybe it will be a little better. Leave my wife. Maybe it will be something different. Just this week I was hearing a prayer request that 45 years into marriage, somebody decided to leave somebody. I'm like, what does that happen? Why does that happen 45 years into it? They run away. And one of the ways people run away is end of their life. I don't have anything to live for. Because they're trying to escape whatever troubles and struggles that they have, whatever conflict that they have. Very good example of this is in Genesis chapter 16, the story of Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah. I'm not going to take you there this morning, but Abraham and Sarah, they want a baby, and they use their servant Hagar, and they have a baby, and there's conflict after the baby has come. They have the baby. Abraham and Sarah also have their baby, and there's all kinds of fights with two families, right? And so Hagar runs away. That's escaping, trying to solve the problem, running away. And the Lord really doesn't want her to run away. The Lord brings her back and promises blessings. So their escaping response is not the best response for us when it comes to conflict. Number two, then, attack response. Well, attack response would be, just wanting to hurt the other person. You hurt me, I'll hurt you back. More interested in winning a conflict than preserving the relationship. Well, you did that, therefore, it has caused me to have a conflict, and the way that I know how to handle that conflict is what? I will attack you. I will assault you, use force or a verbal attack. I will take you to court if I have to, and I will even kill you if I can. And so that would be the attack response. So fleeing or running away is one response most people have learned to do or learned to have. One group of people will say, no, I don't run away. I attack. And so there's a running and then there's attacking. Well, at times they may be needed. At times you may have to say, you know what, this is the kind of person I am. I don't like, I run away. I let somebody run over me and I just bear it and I'm just suffering. And then the other one is like, no, I'm not going to let anybody take advantage of me. I'm going to get even. Those two responses may not be God honoring, and that there's a third way of responding to conflict, and that what I call biblical response. Biblical response. Now again, don't count me wrong, okay? Don't say you're wrong, because sometimes you might have to escape and say, you know what? Let's not make a big deal. I'll just escape. Or sometimes I'll say, you know what? I have to face this, and I have to solve this. But there's a better way to do better things for God, and God would be honored. That would be biblical response. Now, what does that mean? Seeing conflict as an opportunity to demonstrate the love and power of God in our lives. So we are looking biblically. That means we look at a conflict. We have a disagreement. Maybe it's sharp disagreement. We're not going to escalate that to fighting and quarreling and causing all kinds of division in the church. But we're going to use that to make myself better. We're going to use that to make the other person better so that we can together serve God in a better way. And that is what the biblical approach is. So biblical approach would say, don't flee, don't attack. Let's come to a win-win situation that the Lord would be honored and glorified. There are a lot of verses that I can read, but they're found in James chapter 3, verse 18. James 3, verse 18. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So the biblical model then is that righteous people seek for peace. Righteous people see conflict and they try to mend it. Righteous people see division and they want to bring it together. And that is a sign of righteousness, it says. A righteous person who claims to be righteous must live by the principle of peace. Matthew 5 verse 9 says, "Blessed are those peacemakers, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God." When we want to mend things, when we want to make things better, you are acting like a child of God. When you want to destroy things, when you want to bring division and fights and quarrels among us, you are not acting in that spiritual maturity. Romans 12 verse 18 says, "If it's possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men." Peace is a wonderful thought that God gives to us, and that we promote peace to one another. Therefore, let us pursue things that which make for peace, and the things by which one may edify one another. Peace and building up one another is what we're looking at when we talk about conflict. So this is our basically introduction to the topic of conflict management. We're looking at basic concept of what it is and where did it come from and what God wants. In the next couple of weeks, we'll look at further steps, how to follow the things that make for peace. We have communion service this morning, and what a wonderful message with conflict, in the sense that we all live in conflict. Romans 5:1 says, "Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have" what? Peace with God. And that is the exciting part of who we are. As we come to the communion service, we live in the midst of conflicts and problems, and we can't get along. And yet, there was a time when you and God did not get along. There was a time when I was an enemy of God. But because of what Christ did on the cross, He died on the cross for you and for me, for your sins and my sins, and that we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. You put your faith in Him, you ask Jesus to save you, and He wiped away all of your sins, and the enmity was forever taken away. And you became a friend of God. You became a child of God. And the biggest conflict in the history of mankind, God is the one who solved it. God is the one who took that first step to say, "Bill, I'm going to make right with you, and I'm going to take that first step." And what an example for us as we talk about conflicts. We are more like God when we take that step of faith and say, "Lord, help me make peace with my brothers and sisters." So as we think about communion service, are you that agent of peace? Bible also says in Matthew chapter 5, when you go to the altar to offer sacrifices to God, if you think that you have, or you hear of somebody having wrong relationship with you, or a brother having wrong view of you, a brother not getting along with you, what does the scripture say? Leave your gift aside, because it is important that you make things right with people, that you be at peace, that you be in a loving relationship with one another. If you're not there, don't worry what are you going to offer to God, because that offering is not going to mean much. He's not going to accept your offering. This morning as we come to the table, I bring the same reminding to you. Can you truly say that you love one another? Can you truly say that you are taking steps to make peace with God and with others? Examine yourself, the Bible says, and partake in what He has done, and rejoice over what He has done. So as we do that, I would like you to have a prayerful mind, think in your heart, make right with God, make things right with God. If you have any issues with anybody, make that right with God, and you can partake in the communion this morning. So as the men are coming forward for the distribution of the elements, I would like you to be in prayer.